A storm forced her into the wrong carriage, but the widowed Duke begged her to stay. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. The storm was unforgiving, howling across the open landscape, the blizzard turning the world outside into a white void. Marian Blake, a young woman from the nearby town, was running through the snow, her cloak flapping violently behind her. The cold bit at her skin, but she had no choice but to keep moving. She had waited too long at the Barton estate, but her promised carriage had never arrived. With each step, she grew more desperate, the winds pushing her back, threatening to make her lose her way. The snow had come so suddenly, and now, it was as though the entire world had been swallowed by the storm. Then, just when she thought she could go no further, a carriage appeared through the thick snow. She rushed toward it, relief flooding her as she opened the door, believing she had finally found shelter from the storm. But when the door closed behind her, she froze. There, sitting across from her, was not the friendly face of the Barton driver, but a stern, unfamiliar man, his piercing gray eyes locking onto hers. He was silent for a moment, taking in her frantic appearance before speaking in a voice that was as cold as the storm outside. "I believe you have entered the wrong carriage, madam," he said, his tone measured and calm, but something in his gaze suggested that he was more than just a stranger. Marian's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she clutched her worn traveling bag to her chest. "I beg your pardon, sir," she stammered. "I was expecting the Barton's carriage. I shall disembark immediately." She reached for the door, but the carriage was already in motion, the wheels turning over the thick snow. The man looked at her with an air of finality. "That would be unwise in this weather," he replied, his voice unyielding. "Where were you headed?" "Barton House, sir," Marian answered, feeling the panic rise in her chest. The storm was worsening, and she realized she had no other option but to stay in this stranger's carriage. The man seemed to notice her unease and tilted his head slightly. "Barton House is 15 miles in the opposite direction. The roads are becoming impassable." Horror dawned on Marian as she glanced out of the window, the swirling snow completely obscuring the view. She was trapped. "Then I must find an inn," she said, her voice shaking. "Please, if you could stop the carriage." "There are no inns between here and Greycourt Hall," the man replied curtly, "and my driver would not thank me for stopping in this blizzard." Marian's heart sank as she realized that her only option was to stay at this strange, imposing estate. "Greycourt Hall," she repeated, her voice faltering. "Your Grace," she whispered to herself, knowing exactly who this man was. Sebastian Hawkes, the Duke of Greycourt, known throughout the county for his retreat from society following his wife's tragic death. Marian had heard the rumors, how he had shut himself away in his mansion, leaving behind a life of grandeur to live in solitude and grief. The man across from her inclined his head slightly, confirming her suspicion. "I am Sebastian Hawkes," he said, his voice low and controlled. Marian had heard stories about him, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. "Your Grace," she said, her voice trembling. "I apologize for the intrusion. This is most improper." He raised a hand, dismissing her concern with a simple gesture. "As is leaving a woman to freeze to death," he replied, his tone final. The rest of the journey passed in silence, the only sound the steady beat of the horses' hooves against the thick snow. When they finally arrived at Greycourt Hall, the mansion loomed ahead, its stone walls shrouded in shadows. The Duke helped her down from the carriage, his touch firm but impersonal. The massive doors of Greycourt Hall opened to reveal a cold, imposing interior. The place felt like a ghost of its former self, empty and silent, with only the faint glow of a few flickering lights to break the darkness. A butler appeared, and Sebastian spoke with a cold professionalism, ordering the staff to prepare accommodations. "For Marian." "Your Grace, I cannot impose," Marian began, her voice quiet, but he cut her off. "Miss Blake, is it not? The storm is worsening. My driver has just returned from checking the main road. It is completely blocked by snow. No one will be traveling tonight, or likely tomorrow." His expression was unreadable, but there was something about his words that gave Marian pause. There was a weariness in his voice, an unwilling acceptance of this unexpected situation. The East Wing has several suitable rooms, he continued. You will stay until the storm passes, and arrangements can be made for your safe transport to the Bartons. Marian nodded, knowing she had no other choice. Thank you, Your Grace. As she followed the butler down the shadowed corridors of the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that this storm had brought her to more than just a place of refuge. It had brought her into the heart of a man who had shut himself off from the world for years. A man whose grief was as deep as the snow that surrounded them. And she had no idea how long she would be trapped here, with him. The East Wing was cold, but welcoming in its own way, and Marian soon found herself in a room with a bed covered in soft, white linens. The snow outside continued to fall, its quiet rhythm a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. And as Marian sat by the window, staring out into the storm, she couldn't help but wonder what would become of her in this house of grief. Would she stay for the night? Or would the storm keep her here for much longer? The Duke's presence loomed like a shadow over the mansion, and Marian had no choice but to face what was ahead in this strange and cold place. This would be a night of firsts, and she had no idea how it would end. The next morning, Marian woke to the sound of the wind howling outside, the storm still relentless in its fury. The room she had been given was cold, but not unbearably so, with the heavy curtains drawn tightly against the window. The view was almost entirely obscured by the thick snow drifts that had piled up overnight, a silent reminder of how cut off they were from the world. Outside, the faint smell of wood smoke lingered in the air, and the quiet of Greycourt Hall felt almost oppressive after the noise of the storm. She could hear the distant creak of the old house settling, a mansion that seemed to hold its breath as if it too was waiting for something. Marian pulled the thick blanket around her shoulders, reluctant to leave the warmth of the bed, but she knew she had to face the reality of her situation. She was stranded here, alone with a duke who had locked himself away in grief for 5 years. What kind of place was this? And what would her presence in this cold, sorrowful mansion mean for her? She stood and walked over to the window, peering out at the bleak landscape. The mansion was surrounded by vast, frozen grounds that stretched out in all directions. Greycourt Hall, though magnificent, seemed like a shadow of its former self, haunted by the sorrow of its master. She thought of the man who had brought her here, the Duke, Sebastian Hawks. She hadn't expected much from their brief exchange the night before, but the memory of his gaze lingered. There was something more than just coldness in his eyes, a depth of pain that mirrored her own, though she couldn't yet understand why. Perhaps it was his wife's death that had caused him to shut himself away from the world. Marian had heard the whispers, of course, but hearing them was one thing. Seeing it firsthand was another. She needed to get out of this place as soon as possible. Her mind raced with thoughts of how to get back to Barton House, how to continue with the life she had planned. She had not signed up for this. Being here, stranded with a grieving widower, was not part of her plans. Yet, as much as she wanted to escape, part of her felt a strange pull to stay. There was something magnetic about the Duke, something that made her hesitate. Her feet moved without thinking, guiding her down the long, dimly lit hallways of Greycourt Hall. The silence was almost suffocating, and the walls, draped in shadows, seemed to close in on her. She could hear the faint echoes of footsteps ahead of her, and as she turned the corner, she saw him, Duke Sebastian Hawks, standing by the grand staircase. He was looking out of one of the large windows, his back to her. His posture was stiff, as if the weight of his thoughts were too much for him to bear. Marian hesitated, unsure whether to approach him or turn back. She had not spoken to him since the night before, and the tension between them had only grown since then. As she stood there, contemplating her next move, he turned slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of her from the corner of his eye. The moment he saw her, his gaze softened, and for the briefest second, she thought she saw something, regret, perhaps, flicker across his expression. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same mask of indifference he had worn when they first met. "Good morning, Miss Blake," he said, his voice low but steady. There was a coldness to it, but not the harshness of the night before. Marian nodded in return, but her heart was racing. "Your Grace, she didn't know what to say. The words caught in her throat. "I trust you slept well?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, thank you," she replied, unable to mask the unease in her voice. "It's quite a storm, isn't it?" He nodded but didn't respond. Instead, he gestured for her to follow him. "Come, let me show you the library. I believe you'll find it more comfortable there." Marian nodded, though she wasn't sure what to expect. She had no idea why he had suddenly decided to be kind, but she felt an inexplicable need to see what lay behind this new, softer version of the man who had once been so distant. As they walked through the grand hallway, the Duke didn't speak, and Marian remained silent, her mind swirling with confusion. They reached a large, heavy door at the end of the hall, and Sebastian opened it with a slow, deliberate motion. The library was vast, with walls lined with bookshelves filled to the brim. The smell of old paper and leather mixed with the faint scent of the fire that burned softly in the hearth. It was warm here, a stark contrast to the cold of the hallways. "Please, make yourself at home," the Duke said as he stepped aside to let her in. Marian hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room. It was beautiful, classic, elegant, but with a certain sadness in the air. She could almost feel the history of the place, the years of memories trapped within these walls. As she moved deeper into the room, she couldn't help but notice a portrait hanging above the fireplace. It was of a woman, a beautiful woman with auburn hair and a soft, serene smile. Marian stared at it for a moment, feeling an odd pang in her chest. "That's my late wife, Eleanor," the Duke said, his voice softer than before. She loved this room. It was always her favorite place in the house. Marian turned to look at him. His face was unreadable, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before. The fire crackled in the background, and the warmth of the room seemed to make the tension between them melt away just a little. "I'm sorry for your loss," Marian said quietly. The Duke didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the fireplace and stared into the flames. "It's been 5 years," he said, almost to himself. "Yet some days it feels like it happened yesterday." Marian felt a surge of sympathy for him, despite herself. There was something about his vulnerability, about the way he let his guard down for just a moment, that made her want to reach out to him. But she couldn't. She had to remind herself that she was just a guest in his house, and nothing more. She turned her attention back to the portrait. "She looks beautiful." "She was," the Duke replied. "She was the light of this house." Marian didn't know what to say to that. The sadness in his voice was too much for her to bear. She was beginning to feel like an intruder in his grief, and she longed for the moment when the storm would pass, and she could leave. But for now, all she could do was stay in this quiet, frozen house with a man who had once loved, and still loved, a woman who was no longer here. The following morning, Marian woke to the faint light of day streaming through the cracks in the thick curtains, a soft glow that only made the coldness of the room more noticeable. She stretched, the weight of the previous day's events still heavy on her mind. The Duke's coldness, his vulnerability, everything seemed like an unsolvable puzzle. After a few moments of silence, Marian rose from the bed, wrapping herself in a thick robe provided by the housekeeper. The storm outside had not let up. In fact, it seemed to have worsened overnight, the winds howling like some unseen force trying to tear the mansion apart. She glanced toward the window, noticing the snowdrifts had risen considerably overnight, completely covering the paths and making it impossible to see beyond the trees that surrounded the estate. As she walked towards the door, she heard the soft creak of footsteps echoing from the corridor. It was the Duke. His silhouette appeared in the doorway, his figure tall and imposing against the dim light of the hallway. "Good morning, Miss Blake," he greeted, his voice as measured and calm as always. Marian felt an odd flutter in her chest, though she couldn't explain why. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he looked at her, that made the air around them feel charged, though neither of them said anything more than what was strictly necessary. "Your Grace," she responded, meeting his gaze. "I trust you slept well?" he asked, stepping into the room. Marian nodded, though she knew she had not slept well at all. Her thoughts had been too tangled, her mind racing over everything that had happened since she had arrived at Greycourt Hall. The Duke stood at the foot of the bed, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes distant. He was a man wrapped in sorrow, and Marian found herself unable to tear her gaze away from him. "It is a strange feeling, isn't it?" he said suddenly, his voice low. as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. Being trapped in a house with no way out, no escape from the past. Marian blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected him to open up like this, and it startled her to see him so vulnerable, even if only for a moment. "I suppose it is," she replied softly. "But the storm will pass, and things will return to normal." He shook his head, though it was a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "I'm afraid normal doesn't exist for me anymore," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. Marian's heart ached for him. She didn't know the full extent of his grief, but it was clear it had consumed him. "If you ever need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I am here." The Duke looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time since their arrival, Marian saw a flicker of something other than coldness in his eyes. "Thank you, Miss Blake," he said, his tone surprisingly gentle. "But I fear there are some things even words cannot fix." With that, he turned, his heavy footsteps echoing as he walked away, leaving Marian standing in the room, her mind still racing. She had expected to feel relief, but instead, she only felt a growing sense of confusion. The man who had brought her here, the man whose grief seemed to have swallowed him whole, was a mystery she could not unravel. Why did he seem so drawn to her, yet so distant at the same time? She sighed, shaking her head. It was pointless to try to understand him. She was here because of the storm, and soon enough, she would be leaving. That was the only thing she could be sure of. After a few moments, Marian left the room, her footsteps silent as she walked down the long hallway. She was about to head downstairs when she heard the faint sound of voices coming from the library. Curious, she turned toward the door, her hand reaching for the handle. As she stepped inside, she was met with an unexpected sight. The Duke was standing by the fireplace, a small, closed-off smile on his lips as he spoke to a figure Marian hadn't seen before. It was a woman, older, with sharp features and a regal air about her. "Ah, Miss Blake," the Duke said as he noticed Marian entering the room. "This is Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper. She's been here longer than anyone, and I'm sure she has more than enough stories to share about Greycourt Hall." Marian gave a polite nod as Mrs. Winters turned to face her. "I see you found our library," Mrs. Winters said with a warm smile. "It's not much, but we try to keep it well stocked." Marian glanced at the shelves, noticing the dust that covered the books. The place felt so neglected, much like its owner. The Duke had mentioned his wife's love for the house, but it was clear that much had changed since her passing. "Would you like some tea, Miss Blake?" Mrs. Winters asked, already moving to pour a pot from the silver kettle. Marian hesitated for a moment, but nodded. "Yes, thank you." She sat down at one of the armchairs, watching the flames dance in the fireplace as the tension in the room slowly began to ease. There was something oddly comforting about the quiet, about being surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the stillness of the house. Marian took a deep breath, her eyes flicking to the Duke, who stood silently by the window, looking out into the storm. "Is there something troubling you, Your Grace?" Marian asked, breaking the silence. He turned slowly, meeting her gaze. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, and then, in a voice that was barely audible, he spoke. "I'm just waiting for the storm to pass," he said quietly. "It's all I can do." Marian nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. As she sat there, she realized something. They were both waiting. She, for the storm to pass so she could leave, and he, for someone, who might never return. In the days that followed, Marian found herself growing accustomed to the quiet, mournful rhythm of life at Greycourt Hall. The storm had not let up, and though the house was filled with the hum of daily routines, it felt as though time had slowed down, trapped within the icy grip of winter. The Duke, Sebastian Hawks, continued to retreat into his solitude, yet Marian noticed subtle changes. He had begun to leave his study more often, walking through the corridors of the house with an air of forced normalcy, though his eyes always seemed distant, as though he were looking beyond the walls of Greycourt, into a past that he couldn't escape. Marian spent her days wandering the vast estate, reading in the library, or speaking with Mrs. Winters about the history of the house. The housekeeper was a kind woman, though she often spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the heavy silence that hung over the mansion. It was clear that she cared deeply for the Duke, though her loyalty to him seemed to be wrapped in unspoken grief. One morning, As Marian made her way through the grand hallway, she saw the Duke in the distance, standing before a portrait that she had noticed before, one of a beautiful woman with auburn hair and a serene smile. The Duke's expression was unreadable as he gazed at the painting, his hand resting lightly on the frame. Marian stopped in her tracks, unsure whether to approach or leave him in peace. But something about the moment seemed to draw her in. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her footsteps quiet on the marble floor. "Your Grace," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. The Duke turned slowly, his eyes locking with hers for a brief moment before he looked back at the portrait. "She was my wife," he said quietly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "Her name was Eleanor." Marian nodded, stepping closer. "She's beautiful," she said, her voice gentle. "She was," the Duke replied, his voice thick with emotion. "She was the light of this house, the one who made everything feel alive." Marian could hear the pain in his voice, a rawness that he rarely allowed anyone to see. It was as though he was holding on to something precious, something that had slipped away from him forever. "I'm sorry for your loss," Marian said softly, her heart aching for him. The Duke didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts. "It's been 5 years," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And yet some days it feels like it was only yesterday." Marian felt a pang of sympathy for him. She couldn't imagine the weight of losing someone so deeply, and yet, there he stood, trapped in his grief, unable to let go. "Grief is a strange thing," she said, her voice barely audible. "It stays with you, even when you think you've let it go." The Duke's eyes flickered to hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw a hint of understanding in his gaze. "You're right," he said softly. "It stays with you always." The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the background. Marian felt the weight of the moment, the heavy silence that surrounded them. She didn't know what else to say, but she felt as though she couldn't leave him like this, standing alone in the presence of his past. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out, but she stopped herself before making contact. The Duke's eyes locked onto hers again, and, for the briefest of moments, she thought she saw a flicker of something else in his gaze, something other than grief, something almost vulnerable. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the same coldness that had shielded him for so long. "I should go," Marian said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of regret and hesitation. The Duke didn't stop her as she turned to leave, but as she walked away, she could feel his gaze on her back. She didn't know what it was about him that drew her in, but she couldn't deny that she felt a strange connection to him, a bond that neither of them had yet acknowledged. Later that evening, as Marian sat in the drawing room, she couldn't shake the image of the Duke standing before the portrait of his late wife. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the way he had looked at the painting, as though he were still holding on to something he could never have again. Marian found herself thinking about him more and more, about his grief and his solitude, about the quiet moments they shared in the house that seemed to stretch on forever. She couldn't explain it, but there was something about him that made her want to understand him, to reach out to him, to offer him the comfort that he so clearly needed. But she knew it wasn't her place. She was just a guest, stranded in his house because of the storm. Once the weather cleared, she would leave, and the Duke would go on with his life, just as he always had. The next morning, the storm began to subside, though the snow still blanketed the estate in a thick layer of white. Marian knew that it wouldn't be long before she would have to leave Greycourt Hall and return to her life. But as she walked through the halls of the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something was beginning to shift between her and the Duke. She didn't know what it was, but she knew that the storm had brought them together for a reason. And though she couldn't predict the future, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen when the storm finally passed. Days passed at Greycourt Hall, the storm outside slowly subsiding, but the tension inside the mansion remained thick and palpable. Marian spent her days in the library, reading, or wandering through the grand halls, her thoughts constantly drifting back to the Duke. Sebastian Hawkes, the man who had welcomed her into his home, was a mystery she couldn't solve. Each time they spoke, there was a distance between them, a barrier that neither of them seemed willing to cross. Yet, at the same time, there was an undeniable pull, something unspoken that lingered in the air whenever they were in the same room. Marian couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she felt it, a connection that was deeper than just being trapped together in a house during a storm. The Duke's behavior had shifted ever so slightly since that first encounter in the library. He was more present now, though still distant, his cold demeanor tempered by the rare moments of warmth that would occasionally slip through. He seemed to be trying, in his own way, to engage with her, though it was always brief, fleeting. One afternoon, after a long silence between them, Marian found herself in the drawing room, looking out the window at the clearing sky. The snow had stopped falling, and the sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting a soft glow on the white landscape. It was a beautiful sight, and for a moment, Marian felt a sense of calm wash over her. The storm, both outside and within Greycourt Hall, seemed to be finally coming to an end. As she stood by the window, lost in her thoughts, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Turning around, she saw the Duke standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable as always. "Miss Blake," he said, his voice low, but not as cold as usual. "I've been meaning to ask, how are you finding Greycourt Hall?" Marian hesitated for a moment, surprised by the question. She wasn't sure what to say. "It's different," she said carefully, trying to find the right words. "It's beautiful, but it feels empty." The Duke nodded, his gaze flickering to the painting above the fireplace, the portrait of his late wife. "It was full once," he said softly, almost to himself. "When Eleanor was alive, this house was filled with life. Laughter, music, warmth." Marian's heart clenched at the rawness in his voice, the pain that he so carefully tried to hide. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to." "You don't have to apologize," he interrupted, his voice tinged with something like gratitude. "It's not your fault." There was a brief silence between them, a tension that neither of them knew how to address. Marian wasn't sure if she should leave the room, give him space, or stay and try to ease the weight of the silence. Before she could make up her mind, the Duke spoke again, his tone softer now, almost vulnerable. "I never wanted to bring anyone here. After Eleanor." He stopped, as if unable to continue. Marian watched him, her heart aching for him. He had been trapped in his grief for so long, so closed off from the world. She could see it in his eyes, the pain that still haunted him, and she wondered if he would ever let anyone truly see him again. "I never wanted to open up again," he said, almost as if confessing something he had never admitted to anyone. "But there's something about this house, about the memories, that makes it impossible to forget." Marian didn't know what to say to that. She wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that it was okay to let go, to stop hiding behind the walls he had built around himself, but she knew it wasn't that simple. "It's hard," she said softly, her voice full of understanding. "I can't imagine what you've been through, but you don't have to do this alone." The Duke looked at her then, his gaze piercing, as if searching for something in her eyes. For a moment, Marian thought he might say something, anything, to acknowledge the connection between them. But instead, he simply nodded, his expression guarded once more. "I appreciate your words, Miss Blake," he said, his voice cool again. "But I'm afraid there's little anyone can do to ease the past." Marian didn't know what to say to that. She could feel the distance between them growing again, the emotional wall he had built so high that she couldn't reach him. But as she looked at him, she realized something. The storm might have passed, but the real battle was just beginning, for both of them. They were two people, both trapped in their own grief, their own worlds, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward. Marian didn't know what the future held, or what would happen when the storm outside finally cleared. But for the first time since she had arrived at Greycourt Hall, she felt as though there was a possibility of something more, something beyond the pain and the silence. And though the Duke still seemed so far away, she couldn't shake the feeling that their paths were destined to cross in a way neither of them could yet understand. The days that followed were marked by an uncomfortable quiet that settled over Greycourt Hall, like the calm after a storm. The snow continued to blanket the landscape, the world outside still and frozen, while the air inside the mansion seemed to hold its breath. Marian found herself falling into a routine, though it was one that was punctuated by long, silent meals with the Duke and hours spent alone in the library, reading the books she had found scattered throughout the house. Despite the growing familiarity of her surroundings, a tension remained between them, one that neither seemed ready to confront, but one that was impossible to ignore. Sebastian Hawkes, The Duke had become a shadow in the house, a figure who seemed to move through the rooms with a quiet, almost haunting presence. Yet, despite his distance, Marian noticed a subtle change. He was no longer retreating to his study as often as before. He would appear occasionally in the drawing room, standing by the fire, his gaze lost in thought. And sometimes, when their paths crossed, he would nod at her, a silent acknowledgement that lingered between them. Marian, for her part, began to feel a shift as well. Though she was still an outsider in the grand scheme of the mansion, her place here had become more defined. She was no longer just a guest trapped by the storm. She had begun to understand the house, its dark corners, its heavy silence, and its secrets. But it was in the quiet moments, when she found herself alone with her thoughts, that Marian realized something more. She was beginning to care for the Duke. The realization was slow to come, a quiet awareness that crept up on her like the evening fog rolling in over the estate. She had known grief in her own life, in her own way, but the depth of his pain, the way he held on to the past with such fierce determination, touched something in her that she couldn't ignore. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Marian sat in the drawing room, reading a book she had borrowed from the library. The wind howled outside, the sound of the storm still lingering, though its fury had lessened. The room was warm, but Marian couldn't shake the chill that had settled deep within her. She could feel the weight of the Duke's absence, even though he was only a room away. As if on cue, the door to the drawing room creaked open, and Sebastian appeared in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but Marian noticed the faintest shadow of exhaustion in his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them, thick with the unspoken things they both carried. "Miss Blake," the Duke said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I've been thinking about the things you said to me the other day." Marian looked up from her book, surprised by his words. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge their conversation in the library, let alone bring it up again. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said softly, "but I meant what I said." He nodded, stepping further into the room, his gaze flickering toward the fire before settling on her. "I know," he said quietly. "It's just difficult." There was a vulnerability in his voice that Marian had never heard before, and it made her heart ache for him. She set the book aside, her hands trembling slightly. "Grief is a heavy thing," she said, her voice soft but steady. "It doesn't just go away because we want it to." The Duke didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, staring at the fire, his posture rigid, as if he were trying to keep the emotions within him locked away. Marian could see the struggle in his eyes, the way he was fighting to keep his composure. For a long time, neither of them spoke, and the silence seemed to stretch on forever, filling the room with an almost unbearable tension. Finally, the Duke turned to her, his eyes dark, but full of something that was almost raw. "It's been 5 years," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "And yet it feels like I'm still living in that moment." Marian didn't know what to say to that. She could feel the weight of his words, the unbearable grief that had kept him locked in the past for so long. She could see the way it had worn him down, how it had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with time. He wasn't just a duke, a man of power and privilege. He was a man who had lost everything. And she was starting to understand that, to see the depth of his sorrow in a way she hadn't before. "I don't know how to move on," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know how to let go of the past." Marian stood up, her heart racing. She wanted to say something, to reach out to him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she took a tentative step toward him, closing the distance between them. "You don't have to do it alone," she said softly. "You don't have to carry this burden by yourself." The Duke looked at her then, really looked at her, his eyes searching hers for something. Maybe for an answer, or maybe for a sign that it was okay to let go. For a moment, Marian thought he might say something, but instead, he just nodded, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Thank you, Miss Blake," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "You've been a welcome distraction from my thoughts." Marian's heart fluttered at his words, though she didn't know if it was because of his gratitude or the way he had looked at her. She didn't know what this was between them, but she couldn't deny that something was shifting. Something was beginning to change. As the night wore on, they sat in silence, the fire crackling between them, and Marian found herself wondering what would happen next. The storm had passed, but in its wake, something new had begun. Whether it was the beginning of healing, or simply the start of something they could not yet understand, Marian wasn't sure. But she knew one thing for certain. The Duke had finally allowed himself to feel something again. As the days continued to pass, a strange shift began to take place within the walls of Greycourt Hall. The storm had long since passed, but the silence that had enveloped the mansion felt different now, less oppressive, though still heavy with unspoken words. Marian found herself drawn to the Duke more and more, though she could not explain why. The space between them had narrowed, not through words, but through shared moments, through looks that lingered just a moment too long. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Marian couldn't help but feel that something was changing, something that neither of them was yet willing to name. Each evening, after dinner, the Duke would retreat to his study, leaving Marian to her own devices in the drawing room. And each evening, she would sit by the fire, reading or simply staring into the flames, her thoughts tangled with the complexities of her own feelings. It was as if the house itself had become a mirror of the emotional distance between them, grand and cold on the outside, but filled with hidden warmth if you looked hard enough. On one such evening, as Marian sat near the fire, the Duke appeared unexpectedly at the doorway. He wasn't in his usual attire, the sharp, dark suit that always made him look so imposing. Instead, he was wearing something more casual, something that seemed to soften his usually stoic demeanor. A simple shirt, sleeves rolled up, and trousers that didn't scream of wealth or power, but instead of a man who, for once, was not so burdened by the weight of his title. Marian looked up, startled, though she quickly masked her surprise with a polite smile. "Your Grace," she said, standing up in respect. The Duke raised a hand, signaling for her to remain seated. "Please, Miss Blake," he said, his voice unusually soft. "I was wondering if you would join me for a walk." "A walk?" Marian blinked, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. She had never expected him to ask her for something so personal. It was as though, in that moment, the formality of their roles, the Duke and the guest, had shifted, if only for the briefest of moments. "A walk," she repeated, unsure of what he was truly asking. He nodded, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Yes," he said. "The gardens are beautiful, even in winter. And I could use some company." Marian hesitated, but only for a moment. What harm could there be in a simple walk, she thought. It was an invitation, and more than that, it felt like a small, tentative step toward breaking down the walls that had separated them. She nodded, standing up slowly. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. As they stepped outside, the cold air immediately greeted them, but it wasn't as biting as it had been before. The snow, though still thick on the ground, had begun to settle, creating a soft, white blanket across the garden. The tall trees that surrounded the estate were bare, their branches reaching toward the sky like twisted fingers, but there was something hauntingly beautiful about it. They walked in silence at first, the sound of their footsteps crunching in the snow the only noise between them. The Duke didn't seem in a hurry, and Marian found herself appreciating the quiet, the absence of pressure that often came with their interactions. It was as though the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but rather calming. The tension that had once hung in the air was now gone, replaced by an understanding that neither of them could fully explain. "It's peaceful here," Marian said after a while, breaking the silence. "Even in the winter, when everything seems so still." The Duke nodded, his gaze ahead, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "Yes," he agreed. "It's the stillness that I've come to appreciate the most." Marian glanced at him, noting the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly, as though the word stillness carried more weight for him than it did for anyone else. There was a quiet sadness to him, one that was always just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. "You've been here for a long time, haven't you?" Marian asked, her voice soft, unsure if she was crossing a line. He didn't answer right away, his steps slowing as he seemed to contemplate the question. "Yes," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been my home for most of my life." They continued walking, and Marian felt the weight of his words settle between them. There was something undeniably tragic about his attachment to the house, to the memories that it held. It was clear that Greycourt Hall wasn't just a home for him. It was a prison, a place that kept him locked in his grief, unable to fully escape the past. "And Eleanor?" Marian asked, her voice quieter now, as if she were afraid to disturb the delicate balance of their conversation. The Duke stopped walking, and Marian froze, her heart skipping a beat. She had mentioned his late wife, something she had never done before, but she felt as though it was the right moment. The Duke turned toward her, his expression unreadable, though there was a flicker of emotion in his eyes. "Eleanor was everything to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was my world." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final, as if there was no room for anything else. Marian nodded slowly, not sure how to respond. She wanted to offer him comfort, to say the right thing, but she didn't have the words. Instead, she simply stood there, allowing him the space to grieve, to remember. After a long pause, the Duke finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, as though he were speaking to himself. "But she's gone, and I'm still here," he said softly. "And I don't know how to move forward." Marian didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Instead, she reached out, her hand lightly brushing his arm in a gesture that was both gentle and tentative. The Duke didn't pull away, and for the briefest of moments, they stood there together, sharing the weight of the silence, both of them unsure of what the future held but knowing, in that instant, that they were no longer alone. The days following their walk were filled with an unspoken understanding between Marian and the Duke, though neither spoke about it aloud. The shift between them had been subtle, like the gentle thawing of ice, but the connection was there, undeniable. Marian couldn't help but notice the way the Duke seemed to soften in her presence, though he was still the same man who had once been consumed by grief. There was a vulnerability to him now, a rawness that she hadn't seen before, and it left her with a strange mixture of empathy and longing. She had never been one to shy away from others' pain, but the depth of his sorrow made her hesitate. She wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but she knew that such gestures might only push him further away. In the days that followed, they shared more quiet moments together. Sometimes they would sit in the library, each lost in their own thoughts, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable but rather peaceful. Other times, they would take long walks through the estate, not speaking much, but simply existing together in the same space. Marian found herself drawn to him in ways she couldn't fully explain. There was something about the way he moved, the way he carried himself with a quiet dignity that made her want to know him more. But the more she saw of him, the more she realized how much of himself he kept hidden behind his stoic facade. One evening, as the sun began to set and the air grew cooler, Marian found herself alone in the garden, her thoughts wandering as she gazed at the fading light. The Duke had been distant that day, lost in his own thoughts as usual, and she had come outside to clear her mind. The garden, though sparse in the winter months, was still beautiful in its own way. The bare trees stood like sentinels, their branches reaching out to the sky, and the quiet was only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As Marian walked slowly through the garden, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to find the Duke standing at the entrance, his gaze fixed on her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the world around them had disappeared, leaving only the two of them in the stillness of the garden. "You're out here alone," he said, his voice soft but concerned. Marian smiled faintly, not sure how to respond. "I just needed some fresh air," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The Duke stepped forward, his eyes searching hers. "I understand," he said quietly. "Sometimes, the weight of everything becomes too much to bear inside." Marian didn't know what to say to that, but the words he spoke resonated with her. She, too, had felt that weight, though in a different way. The weight of expectations, of duty, of grief. It was all a heavy burden to carry, and sometimes, it was easier to simply walk away from it all, even if only for a moment. The Duke took another step closer, his presence drawing her in like gravity. She could feel the tension between them, the unspoken words, the emotions that neither of them dared to voice. It was as though they were both standing on the edge of something they both felt but were too afraid to acknowledge. "Miss Blake," the Duke said, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "I know I have been distant, but I wanted to say thank you for being here, for listening, for understanding." Marian's heart swelled at his words, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was rare for the Duke to show such vulnerability, and hearing him acknowledge it made her feel something she hadn't expected: hope. "You don't have to thank me," she replied gently. "I'm just here, Your Grace. I'm not going anywhere." The Duke's eyes softened, a flicker of emotion passing through them. "I don't know what to do with all of this," he said, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to move forward." Marian took a deep breath, feeling a wave of empathy wash over her. She could feel the weight of his grief, the heaviness of the past that he couldn't seem to let go of. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she said quietly. "Sometimes, the only thing you can do is take it one day at a time." The Duke looked at her, his gaze steady and searching. For a moment, Marian thought he might say something more, but instead, he nodded slowly. "One day at a time," he echoed softly. And in that moment, Marian realized something she hadn't fully understood before. He wasn't just trapped by his grief. He was also trapped by the expectations placed on him, by the weight of his title, and the role he had been forced to play. He didn't know who he was outside of the Duke, outside of the man who had lost everything. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew this. She wasn't alone in her struggle. They were both struggling, in different ways, but their paths had crossed for a reason. And though she couldn't see the future, she knew that this moment, this quiet exchange, was a step towards something they could neither name nor fully understand yet, but something that had the potential to change them both. As the evening drew to a close, the Duke offered Marian a small, fleeting smile, and for the first time since she had arrived at Greycourt Hall, she saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Enough to make her believe that, perhaps, there was a way forward after all. As the days passed, a new rhythm settled over Greycourt Hall. The storm had long since passed, leaving behind a serene landscape. But the emotional storm that had plagued the Duke and Marian still lingered. The Duke, Sebastian Hawks, was no longer the same distant man he had been when she first arrived. Though his grief had not disappeared, it was no longer the defining thing about him. There was still a quiet sadness in his eyes, but there was something else now too. A glimmer of something that resembled hope, something he had been unwilling to acknowledge before. Marian had noticed this change in him, and though it was subtle, it made her feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. It was the kind of hope that was fragile, but it was there. They still spent their days in the same way, quiet, mostly solitary, but with moments of shared presence that had slowly become more comfortable. They would occasionally meet for meals, but there were no longer the heavy silences that once made those moments feel unbearable. Instead, there was a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken but understood. One afternoon, after a week of steady snowfall, Marian found herself standing at the window of the drawing room, watching the sun break through the clouds for the first time in days. The landscape was a soft, untouched white, as though the world was starting over, waiting for something new to emerge. She was lost in the beauty of it when she heard a voice behind her. "Miss Blake." The Duke's voice was soft but firm. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his posture relaxed, though his gaze was still as intense as ever. "Your Grace," she said with a smile, though her heart was racing a little. "It's beautiful out there, isn't it?" He nodded, stepping into the room. "It is," he said quietly. "It's moments like this that remind me there's still beauty in the world, even in the darkest of times." Marian felt the weight of his words, the hint of vulnerability that he allowed to slip through. "I've been thinking," he continued, walking toward the window where she stood. "About everything. About Eleanor, about the years I've spent locked in grief. And about you." Marian's heart skipped a beat at the mention of her name. She had known, in some quiet corner of her mind, that this conversation was coming. But even so, she felt unprepared. "I didn't ask you to change anything," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You don't have to try to be different for me. You're allowed to grieve. You're allowed to be who you are." The Duke looked at her then, his gaze searching, as if he were seeing her for the first time. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't want to be this man anymore. I don't want to be the man who hides from the world, from everything that's good in it." Marian took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of his words. She had seen him struggle with his grief, and she had been there, offering him support in whatever way she could. But she had also known that he had to find his way on his own. And now, it seemed, he was starting to. You don't have to do it alone, she said softly. You've already taken the hardest step. The Duke gave her a small, grateful smile. Maybe, but it still feels like there's so much more to do. Marian nodded, understanding all too well. One step at a time, she said, her voice gentle but firm. That's all any of us can do. He looked at her then, and for the first time, the distance between them seemed to close completely. There was no longer any barrier between them, no longer any unspoken weight hanging in the air. He stepped closer, and Marian didn't move away. They were standing inches apart now, and the space between them felt more intimate than it ever had before. I never thought I'd find someone who would understand, the Duke said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not after everything. Marian met his gaze, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. I understand more than you know, she said softly. The Duke's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Marian thought he might say something more, but instead, he simply reached out, his hand brushing hers in a quiet gesture of reassurance. The touch sent a jolt of warmth through her, and she realized in that moment that there was no turning back from this. She was no longer a guest in his house, nor was he a distant figure in her life. They were two people who had been through their own storms, and now, together, they were starting to rebuild something new. The Duke didn't speak again, but the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with understanding, filled with a promise of things yet to come. As they stood there, side by side, looking out at the snow-covered grounds, Marian couldn't help but feel that this moment was the beginning of something. Something that neither of them could predict, but something that had the potential to change everything. And for the first time since she had arrived at Greycourt Hall, Marian felt a sense of peace settle over her. The storm had passed, and in its wake, something beautiful was beginning to take shape.